We were very interested in hiring you, Ms. Whitaker, until your mother called and warned us you had a criminal record," the woman on the phone said softly, like she was embarrassed for me. I stood frozen in the middle of my tiny kitchen, one hand gripping the edge of the counter, so hard my knuckles turned white. For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard her. The old refrigerator behind me hummed loudly in the silence, while the coffee I'd forgotten to drink sat growing cold beside the sink. "I'm sorry," I whispered. The hiring manager hesitated. "Your mother contacted our office yesterday afternoon. She said you had a history of fraud and emotional instability." She sounded very concerned. My chest tightened so suddenly I had to sit down. At 67 years old, after raising a son, surviving a difficult marriage, caring for aging parents, and working honestly my entire life, I had never even received a parking ticket. Yet somehow my own mother was calling employers and telling them I was dangerous. Outside my apartment window, rain tapped softly against the glass. The kind of slow Ohio rain that makes everything feel gray and heavy. I stared at the peeling wallpaper near the kitchen table and tried to steady my breathing. "There must be some mistake," I said carefully. "I've never had a criminal record." "I figured there might be more to the story," the woman replied quietly. "Honestly, your interview was excellent. But once we received that call, corporate became uncomfortable moving forward." I closed my eyes. There it was again. Another polite rejection. Another interview that had seemed promising before suddenly disappearing into silence. For 6 months, I had blamed my age. I told myself companies didn't want older workers anymore. I convinced myself the economy had changed. I thought maybe my resume looked outdated or my hands trembled too much during interviews. But now, sitting in my dim little apartment with overdue electric bills stacked beside me, I realized something far worse was happening. Someone had been destroying my chances before I ever had an opportunity to rebuild my life. And somehow, impossibly, that someone was my own mother. "Thank you for being honest with me," I managed to say before ending the call. My reflection stared back at me from the dark microwave door across the kitchen. Silver hair pulled into a loose bun. Pale blue sweater with tiny pills forming around the sleeves because I couldn't afford new clothes. Tired eyes that suddenly looked much older than 67. I thought about my parents sitting comfortably in their large colonial house across town. My father Richard with his polished shoes and cold expressions. My mother Elaine arranging flowers in the spotless dining room she cared about more than people. Growing up, they had always controlled everything. What I wore, who I dated, what church I attended. Even after I married and had my son Daniel, they still treated me like a reckless teenager incapable of making decisions. When my marriage collapsed 12 years ago, my mother had called it proof that I was too emotional to maintain stability. When I lost my administrative job during the pandemic, my father told me maybe it was finally time to accept reality and stop pretending to be independent. I should have recognized the warning signs back then. But they're your parents. No matter how old you get, some part of you keeps hoping they'll eventually love you gently. My phone buzzed suddenly against the kitchen table, making me jump. It was Daniel. I stared at his name for a long moment before answering. "Hey, Mom," he said distractedly. I could hear children shouting somewhere in the background. My grandkids probably running through the living room again, while Heather complained about the noise. "How'd the interview go?" I swallowed carefully. "They aren't hiring me." A pause. "I'm sorry." He sounded tired, not surprised. "You'll find something else." I almost told him everything right then. I almost told him his grandparents had been secretly sabotaging my life. But something stopped me. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was the exhaustion of sounding crazy. Or maybe it was because deep down, I already suspected he wouldn't fully believe me. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Maybe. Heather's making dinner, so I should go. Love you, Mom." "Love you too." The line disconnected. Before I could say anything else, I set the phone down slowly and stared at the rain outside. My apartment smelled faintly like damp carpet and cheap laundry detergent. The ceiling leaked whenever storms got bad enough, and the heater rattled all winter long. But it was all I could afford after my savings disappeared helping my parents over the years. Hospital bills, prescription costs, home repairs my father insisted he couldn't manage alone anymore despite still golfing twice a week. I had emptied retirement accounts to care for them, while they slowly convinced everyone around us that I was unstable and financially irresponsible. The realization settled over me piece by piece like ice water soaking through fabric. This wasn't new. It couldn't be. No employer reacts that quickly from one phone call unless someone has been consistently contacting them, which meant my parents had likely been doing this for months, maybe longer. Every interview, every application, every hopeful little moment where I dared believe life might improve again. They were destroying it behind my back. I stood slowly and walked to the small bookshelf near the living room window. On the top shelf sat an old framed photograph from 20 years ago, me standing beside my parents at Daniel's college graduation. Back then, I still smiled naturally around them. Back then, I still thought approval was something I could earn if I just tried harder. My mother had her arm wrapped tightly around mine in the picture, smiling proudly for the camera while quietly criticizing my weight moments earlier. "You should really start taking better care of yourself, Margaret," she'd whispered before the photo was taken. "People judge mothers by how their daughters look." I remembered laughing nervously because that's what I always did around her. I made excuses for cruelty because acknowledging it felt too painful. The rain outside grew heavier. Cars splashed through puddles on the street below, while thunder rumbled softly in the distance. I sat back down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. My email inbox filled the screen. Rejections. Polite corporate language. "We've decided to pursue other candidates. Unfortunately, we are moving in a different direction. We appreciate your interest." I suddenly noticed something I hadn't before. Several interviews ended immediately after employers requested references or background verification. My stomach twisted. They hadn't just ruined one opportunity. They had poisoned all of them. A memory surfaced suddenly from 3 months earlier. I'd interviewed at a local bookstore downtown. The manager, a kind woman named Susan Keller, had practically offered me the position during the interview itself. She loved that I knew classic literature and had previous office experience. She even walked me through employee scheduling software while smiling warmly. Then 2 days later, she'd sent a stiff rejection email that felt strangely cold compared to our conversation. At the time, I'd cried in my car for 20 minutes afterward because I couldn't understand what I'd done wrong. Now I understood. Someone had called her too. I leaned back slowly in my chair, feeling something shift deep inside me. For months, I'd blamed myself. I thought I was becoming invisible because I was old. I thought maybe I wasn't useful anymore. But this wasn't about age. It was sabotage. Deliberate. Personal. Cruel. And for the first time in a very long time, I stopped feeling ashamed of my failures. Instead, I felt angry. Quietly angry. The kind of anger that settles deep and cold instead of loud and explosive. My mother always said I was too soft to survive without them. My father loved reminding me that the world was dangerous and I couldn't trust my own judgment. Maybe they believed ruining my independence would force me back under their control permanently. Maybe they enjoyed watching me struggle because it made them feel powerful. I didn't know yet. But sitting there alone while thunder rolled over the city, I made a decision. I was going to find out exactly how many lives my parents had destroyed trying to control mine. And when I uncovered the truth, I was never going to let them treat me like a frightened little girl again. That night, I barely slept. The rain continued long after midnight, tapping against the old apartment windows, while the heater rattled beside my bed like it was struggling to stay alive. Around 2 in the morning, I finally gave up pretending I would rest and walked into the kitchen wearing my faded gray robe and thick wool socks. The apartment felt colder than usual. Or maybe it was just me. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and stood quietly by the sink, staring at the parking lot outside. A single street lamp reflected off the wet pavement while someone in the building across from mine smoked on their balcony under an umbrella. For a moment, I envied how simple their life looked from a distance. No secrets, no manipulation, no parents quietly destroying them behind closed doors. I kept replaying the phone call in my head. The woman had sounded uncomfortable, almost sympathetic, which meant my mother must have sounded convincing enough to scare them, but dramatic enough to make them uneasy. That was Elaine Whitaker's specialty. She never screamed. She never lost control. She simply planted poison softly enough that people mistook it for concern. Growing up, she used the same voice when speaking to teachers, neighbors, church friends, and eventually my husband. Margaret means well, but she gets overwhelmed easily. Margaret has always been sensitive. You know how emotional she can be. Tiny harmless-sounding comments delivered with a sad smile and lowered eyes until eventually everyone around me started treating me like fragile glass. Even Daniel. Especially Daniel. By 7 the next morning, I was already dressed and sitting at the small kitchen table with my old laptop open again. Sunlight pushed weakly through the clouds outside, turning the apartment walls a dull gray. I pulled up every rejection email I had received over the past 6 months and started writing down dates. Grocery stores, reception jobs, community centers, 2 bookstores, a dental office, a church administrative position, even a part-time cashier job at a garden center 20 minutes away. At first, I had felt embarrassed applying for jobs that paid $14 or $15 an hour after decades of office work. But pride disappears quickly when rent keeps rising and prescription prices climb every few months. Last winter, I skipped turning the heat on during the daytime just to afford my blood pressure medication. I told Daniel everything was fine because I did not want to become a burden. Funny how that word always followed me around my family. Burden, difficult, emotional, unstable. I stared at the list of employers and noticed a pattern immediately. Most interviews went well until references or background checks entered the conversation. Then suddenly everything changed. The silence afterward always felt abrupt, almost awkward, like someone had flipped a switch behind the scenes. A memory surfaced from early spring. I had interviewed at a small insurance office downtown. The manager, a cheerful man named Carl, spent nearly 40 minutes discussing schedules and benefits with me. He even joked that I reminded him of his older sister because I organized paperwork so neatly. Then, near the end of the interview, he asked casually, "Do you mind if we contact family references as part of the onboarding process?" At the time, I thought nothing of it. I gave him my parents' information because I honestly believed no parent would ever intentionally sabotage their own child. 2 days later, Carl left me a voicemail saying they had decided to move in another direction. I remembered crying quietly in the parking lot afterward while holding a paper bag with generic groceries inside. Bread, soup, eggs, things I bought only because they were cheap. Back then, I blamed myself for not sounding confident enough during the interview. Now I wondered what exactly my father had told him. My stomach twisted painfully. I closed the laptop and rubbed my temples slowly. The apartment was silent except for the refrigerator humming behind me. Then my phone buzzed again. Heather this time. I almost ignored it. "Hi, Margaret," my daughter-in-law said brightly the moment I answered. Her voice always sounded polished, like someone speaking carefully in front of an audience. "I just wanted to check in. Daniel said your interview did not work out." I leaned back in my chair. "No, it did not. I am sorry to hear that." A pause followed. Then came the sentence that made something inside me tighten. "Maybe this is the universe telling you to slow down a little. You do not need to prove anything anymore." There it was again. That same gentle pressure everyone seemed to place on older women once we stopped being useful to them. Sit down. Stay quiet. Stop trying. Become small enough to manage comfortably. "I still need income," I replied calmly. "Of course. But maybe you should think about assisted living eventually. Your parents have mentioned being worried about you." I felt my grip tighten around the phone. My parents had been speaking about me to Heather too. Of course they had. Worried about what exactly? I asked quietly. Heather hesitated just long enough to answer my question without saying it directly. "You know how older people can struggle after isolation. Daniel worries too." I looked around my apartment slowly. The stack of unpaid bills, the old furniture, the framed photos. Suddenly I saw it clearly. They were building a narrative around me. Not just unemployed, unstable, dependent, vulnerable. The kind of woman people eventually place somewhere safe, while other family members quietly take control of her life. My chest felt cold. "I should go," I said evenly. "I have errands today." "All right. Take care of yourself." After the call ended, I sat motionless for several seconds. Then I stood up abruptly and walked toward the hallway closet where I kept old paperwork in cardboard boxes. Dust floated into the air as I dragged them into the living room one by one. Tax returns, insurance documents, old birthday cards, medical paperwork from my parents' surgeries. I spent nearly 2 hours sorting through everything before finally finding what I was looking for. A small spiral notebook from 8 years ago when I temporarily helped manage my father's appointments after his knee replacement. Inside were passwords, doctor contacts, medication schedules, and notes I had written during stressful months taking care of both of them. One entry stopped me cold. Elaine called my supervisor again today. Said I sounded exhausted and should reduce responsibilities before I embarrassed myself professionally. I stared at the sentence. For a very long time, I had forgotten completely about that incident. At the time, my supervisor pulled me aside and gently suggested taking stress leave because someone close to me seemed concerned about my mental health. I remembered feeling humiliated but confused. Now I understood. My mother had been doing this for years. Not just jobs. My entire life. Every time I gained confidence or independence, she quietly interfered until I doubted myself again. The realization made me physically nauseous. I walked slowly into the bathroom and splashed cold water onto my face. The woman staring back at me in the mirror no longer looked confused. She looked exhausted, angry, awake. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. 3 years ago, shortly after my divorce was finalized, I had considered moving to North Carolina with an old friend named Linda, who offered me a position helping run her antique shop. I had been excited for the first time in years. Then my father suffered what my mother described as a severe health scare. She cried on the phone, saying they needed me close by because I was all they had left. I stayed in Ohio. 2 months later, I discovered my father had never actually been hospitalized at all. He simply needed routine blood pressure monitoring. At the time, I convinced myself it was miscommunication. Now I knew better. They could not allow me to build a life beyond their reach. A slow heaviness settled over the apartment as afternoon sunlight faded behind thick clouds again. I sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring at old family photographs spread across the surface like evidence from a crime scene. Every smile suddenly looked staged. Every holiday felt false. I thought about all the years I spent trying to become the daughter they wanted. The years I wasted apologizing for things that were never wrong with me in the first place. Then, for the first time in decades, I stopped asking myself why they treated me this way. Instead, I started asking a different question entirely. How many other people knew? The next morning, I drove across town to the bookstore where I had interviewed back in March. The sky hung low and pale over Columbus, and the cold spring wind rattled bare tree branches along the sidewalks. My old Honda made a faint grinding noise every time I pressed the brakes, another repair I had been postponing for months because rent always came first. As I pulled into the small parking lot beside the bookstore, I almost turned around twice. Part of me still wanted to believe I was imagining all of this, that maybe loneliness and stress had twisted harmless moments into something darker. But another part of me already knew the truth. Deep down, I think I had always known. The bookstore looked warm from outside. Soft yellow lights glowed through the windows, and a handwritten sign near the entrance advertised a local author event happening that weekend. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I had taken extra time brushing my hair that morning and wore the navy blue coat I saved for interviews and church services. It suddenly struck me how often women my age try to make ourselves appear smaller, neater, calmer, less threatening to the world around us. Especially when we have spent years being told we are too much, too emotional, too sensitive, too difficult. I took a slow breath and stepped out of the car. The bell above the bookstore door chimed softly as I walked inside. The familiar scent of paper and coffee drifted through the air immediately. Behind the front counter stood Susan Keller, the same woman who had interviewed me months earlier. Her auburn hair was pinned loosely back today, and reading glasses rested low on her nose while she organized invoices. When she looked up and saw me, surprise flashed across her face first, then discomfort. That alone told me everything. "Margaret," she said carefully. "Hello." I forced a polite smile. "I hope I am not interrupting anything." "No, not at all." But her voice sounded strained. She glanced around the empty store before setting the papers aside. "How have you been?" I almost laughed at the question. Exhausted, broke, betrayed by my own parents. But instead I simply nodded. "I actually came because I wanted to ask you something directly." Her shoulders stiffened slightly. "All right." I clasped my hands together tightly so she would not notice them shaking. "After my interview here, did someone contact you about me?" For a moment, Susan said nothing. I watched her face carefully as several emotions crossed it at once. Guilt, sympathy, hesitation. Finally, she sighed quietly and motioned toward the small cafe corner near the back of the store. "Would you like some coffee?" 10 minutes later, we sat across from each other at a tiny wooden table beside the window. Outside, pedestrians hurried through the cold carrying umbrellas and shopping bags while soft instrumental music played overhead inside the store. Susan wrapped both hands around her coffee cup before finally speaking. I have been feeling terrible about this for months, she admitted softly. My chest tightened. So it is true. She nodded slowly. A woman called the morning after your interview. She introduced herself as your mother. Even hearing the words out loud made something inside me ache. Susan continued carefully. At first she sounded very sweet. Concerned. She said she knew you had applied for work here and wanted to warn us privately because she was afraid you might not disclose certain personal issues. I stared down at my untouched coffee. My mother always knew exactly how to sound believable. What kind of issues? I asked quietly. Susan hesitated again. She implied you had a history of dishonesty, financial problems, emotional instability after your divorce. She said your family had spent years trying to support you, but that you struggled to function independently. Each sentence landed like another stone placed carefully onto my chest. Calmly, deliberately. My own mother had built an entire false version of me for strangers. Susan looked genuinely upset now. Honestly, Margaret, I did not fully believe her. You seemed thoughtful and capable during the interview. But then, she stopped. Then what? Her expression shifted uncomfortably. Your father called later that afternoon, too. I looked up sharply. My father. She nodded. He confirmed everything your mother said. He told me your family worried you might become confused handling cash or customer information. For several seconds, I could not speak at all. The bookstore around us faded into background noise while memories surfaced one after another. My father correcting me sharply in front of relatives when I misspoke as a child. My mother apologizing to people for my behavior, even when I had done nothing wrong. Their constant insistence that I could not manage life properly without them. It had never been concern. It was conditioning. Susan leaned forward slightly. Margaret, I am truly sorry. Looking back, I realize how manipulative the whole situation was. But at the time, they sounded convincing because they were your parents. I nodded slowly. That was the cruel genius of it. Parents are automatically trusted, especially older parents speaking softly about an unmarried daughter struggling later in life. Society always assumes mothers know their children best, even when those mothers are quietly destroying them. You are not the only employer they contacted, are you? I asked. Susan looked down immediately. No. My stomach dropped. How many? I do not know exactly. But after your interview here, another business owner mentioned receiving a similar phone call about someone they were considering hiring. He did not say your name directly, but I suspected it was you. A cold heaviness spread through my body. My parents had not just interfered once or twice. They had created a campaign, a slow, systematic effort to isolate me financially and socially until dependence became my only option. Susan reached carefully into her purse and removed a folded sticky note. I almost threw this away months ago, but something about the situation bothered me enough that I kept it. She handed it across the table. Written neatly in blue ink was my mother's phone number beside a short note in Susan's handwriting. Elaine Whitaker called again. Concerned daughter may seek employment despite instability. I stared at the paper, so long the words began to blur slightly. Proof. Actual proof. Not just suspicions or memories I could second-guess later. My mother had actively contacted employers to sabotage me, and she had done it repeatedly enough that strangers documented it. Why would parents do something like this? Susan asked quietly before quickly adding, I am sorry. That is probably not my place to ask. But I found myself answering anyway. Because if I cannot support myself, eventually I have to go back to them. Saying the words aloud made the truth feel horrifyingly simple. My parents did not want me independent. They wanted me controlled. Susan looked genuinely disturbed now. That is not concern. That is cruelty. I glanced toward the bookstore shelves lined neatly with novels and biographies while a young couple browsed nearby, laughing quietly together. Such ordinary, peaceful moments happening around me while my entire understanding of family unraveled piece by piece. My whole life? I said slowly, almost to myself. They convinced me I was weak. Every time I tried to build something on my own, somehow it collapsed. I thought there was something wrong with me. Susan shook her head immediately. There is nothing wrong with you, Margaret. The kindness in her voice nearly broke me, because sometimes strangers see us more clearly than family ever does. I folded the sticky note carefully and placed it inside my purse. Then I looked back at Susan. Would you be willing to tell me exactly what they said if I need it later? Her expression sharpened slightly. Later, I met her eyes steadily for the first time that morning. I am not entirely sure yet. But I think my parents have been controlling my life for much longer than I realized. Outside the bookstore window, snowflakes had started drifting softly through the gray afternoon sky, even though spring was supposed to be arriving soon. Ohio weather never fully trusted warmth to stay. And suddenly, neither did I. By the time I drove home from the bookstore, the snow had turned into freezing rain. Thin sheets of ice clung to the sidewalks, and the windshield wipers struggled to keep up as cars crawled carefully through downtown traffic. My hands stayed tight around the steering wheel the entire drive home, but not because of the weather. My whole life felt different now. Not suddenly different. Revealed different. Like a photograph slowly developing in darkroom chemicals until hidden shapes finally become visible. Every memory I touched now carried a second meaning underneath it. Every conversation with my parents suddenly sounded less like concern and more like strategy. I carried that little sticky note from Susan into my apartment like it weighed 10 pounds. The moment I stepped inside, the familiar smell of old carpet and radiator heat wrapped around me. Usually the apartment felt lonely after long days out, but tonight it felt strangely safe. Small. Quiet. Mine. I locked the door carefully behind me and hung my coat by the entrance before walking straight to the kitchen table. Outside, freezing rain ticked softly against the windows while the early evening sky darkened into deep blue. I placed the sticky note beside my unpaid bills and simply stared at it for several minutes. Elaine Whitaker called again. Concerned daughter may seek employment despite instability. My mother had not even hidden her intentions. Concerned daughter may seek employment. As if independence itself was dangerous. I leaned back slowly in my chair and closed my eyes. Suddenly I was 23 again, standing in my parents' dining room wearing a cream-colored dress while my mother adjusted the collar with cold fingers before church. "Do not talk too much tonight," she whispered. "People already think you are emotional after the engagement ended." I remembered blinking at her in confusion because I had not been emotional at all. Sad, yes. Heartbroken, certainly. But composed. Yet somehow, by the end of that evening, several women from church had hugged me with pity in their eyes while asking if I was coping all right. My mother had prepared the story before I even entered the room. Another memory surfaced immediately after that one. 10 years ago, after Daniel graduated college, I had interviewed for a management position at a medical office. The pay would have nearly doubled my income at the time. I remembered coming home excited after the final interview because the administrator practically promised me the job. 2 days later, the office called to say they had concerns about my reliability under pressure. Reliability under pressure. I sat upright suddenly. That exact phrase. My father used it constantly whenever he criticized me growing up. Margaret has never handled pressure well. He said it after I cried during math homework at 12. After I struggled during my divorce at 49. After I forgot a casserole dish at Thanksgiving one year because I was exhausted from working overtime. Reliability under pressure. Not corporate language. Richard Whitaker language. A cold shiver moved through me despite the heat inside the apartment. How many jobs had they stolen from me over the years without my knowledge? How many friendships had quietly faded because my mother poisoned people against me first? How many moments of self-doubt actually belonged to them instead of me? My phone buzzed softly against the kitchen counter, pulling me from the spiral of memories. Daniel again. I hesitated before answering. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice sounded distracted but gentler than usual tonight. "How are you doing?" I almost said fine automatically. Years of conditioning still pushed the word toward my mouth even now. But something inside me had started changing. "Honestly," I said quietly. "Not very well." Silence followed for a second. Then I heard him move somewhere quieter away from the children. "What is going on?" I stared out the window at the icy parking lot below. "I think Grandma and Grandpa have been interfering with my job applications." The silence afterwards stretched so long I could hear his breathing faintly through the phone. Finally, he spoke carefully. "What do you mean interfering?" "Calling employers. Saying things about me." Another pause. "Mom." That one word carried everything. Doubt. Discomfort. Caution. The exact reaction I feared. I closed my eyes briefly. "I have proof now, Daniel." "What kind of proof?" "A bookstore manager admitted Grandma and Grandpa contacted her after my interview and warned her not to hire me." I expected shock. Outrage. Instead, he sighed quietly. "You know how protective they are." My chest tightened painfully. "Protective? Mom, maybe they are just worried about you struggling financially right now." I laughed softly before I could stop myself. Not a happy laugh. The kind people make when reality finally becomes too absurd to process politely. Your grandparents told employers I was unstable. Daniel went silent again. Then finally he said the sentence that broke something open inside me completely. Well, you have been under a lot of stress these past few years. I gripped the edge of the table so tightly my fingers hurt. There it was. The story they built about me had already reached him too. Maybe years ago. Maybe decades ago. Slowly and subtly enough that he never noticed it happening. Do you believe I am unstable? I asked quietly. He answered too slowly. I think maybe everybody is trying to help in their own way. Help. Such a harmless word for something so cruel. I looked around my apartment again. The thrift store lamp beside the couch. The stack of library books near the recliner. The half-empty bottle of blood pressure medication beside the sink because I was stretching doses to save money. This was what their help looked like. Isolation. Fear. Dependency. Did Heather tell you to call? I asked suddenly. He sounded surprised. What? Did she know about this conversation already? Another hesitation. Tiny. But enough. She just thought you sounded upset earlier. Of course she did. My parents had likely spent years shaping how Daniel and Heather viewed me too. Not openly. Never openly. Just little comments over holidays and family dinners. Margaret gets overwhelmed easily. Margaret struggles making decisions. Margaret has always needed guidance. I suddenly remembered Christmas 2 years ago at my parents' house. My mother had laughed softly while telling Heather, "You have no idea how hard it was raising Margaret. Such a sensitive child." Everyone smiled politely while I sat there holding a coffee mug in silence like some difficult old family pet they all tolerated together. Back then, I felt embarrassed. Tonight, for the first time, I felt furious. Not explosive furious. Quiet furious. The dangerous kind that settles slowly and permanently. I have to go, I said calmly. Mom. Good night, Daniel. I ended the call before he could continue. Then I sat motionless in the kitchen while freezing rain tapped steadily against the windows. For most of my life, I believed love meant endurance. Keeping peace. Swallowing hurt quietly to protect family harmony. But sitting there alone at 67 years old, I finally understood something that should have been obvious decades ago. People who truly love you do not spend years convincing the world you cannot survive without them. My gaze drifted back to the sticky note beside the bills. Elaine Whitaker called again. The word again echoed through my mind louder than anything else. Again meant repetition. Habit. Routine. My mother had done this enough times for strangers to document it casually. Suddenly another memory surfaced, so clearly it made my stomach drop. Last summer, I applied for a receptionist job at a retirement community 15 minutes outside town. A woman from Human Resources called afterwards sounding oddly uncomfortable. Before ending the conversation, she asked one strange question. Do you have family support nearby? At the time, I thought she was simply making conversation about transportation. Now I understood. Someone had already painted me as fragile and dependent before I ever walked through the door. I stood slowly from the table and walked toward the bedroom closet where I kept old family paperwork and photo albums. If my parents had spent years controlling my future behind the scenes, then somewhere inside the past there would be more evidence. More patterns. More lies I failed to recognize at the time. And for the first time in my entire life, I was finally ready to look directly at them. The following Saturday, I drove to my parents' house for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. The sky was clear again after days of freezing rain, but patches of dirty snow still clung stubbornly to the edges of lawns throughout their neighborhood. Maplewood Drive looked exactly the same as it had for decades. Large brick homes, carefully trimmed hedges, American flags hanging neatly from porches. The kind of neighborhood where people waved politely while quietly tracking everyone else's business through kitchen windows. My parents' colonial house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac like always, perfectly maintained down to the last detail. My father still polished the brass mailbox every spring. My mother changed the wreath on the front door for every season, whether guests were coming or not. Growing up, appearances mattered more than comfort inside that house. I parked along the curb and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I had not told them I was coming. For years, surprising my parents was considered rude because they liked control over every interaction. Every visit had to happen on their schedule, with enough warning for my mother to prepare the correct version of herself. But today, For the first time in my life, I did not care. The cold wind bit sharply against my cheeks as I walked toward the front porch. I noticed fresh white flowers planted near the walkway and immediately recognized my mother's touch. Even now, she curated beauty carefully around herself like armor. I rang the doorbell once. A few seconds later, footsteps approached slowly inside the house. Then the door opened. My mother stood there wearing a pale green sweater set and pearl earrings despite it being barely noon on a Saturday. Her silver hair rested perfectly in place as always. For one brief moment, genuine surprise crossed her face before smoothing instantly into warm concern. "Margaret," she said softly. "What a nice surprise." That voice. Calm, sweet, harmless sounding. The same voice that destroyed my life behind closed doors. I smiled politely. I was nearby. A lie. But apparently lies ran in the family. "Well, come in before you freeze out there." The house smelled faintly like lemon polish and cinnamon candles. Familiar. Suffocatingly familiar. Every piece of furniture sat exactly where it had been my entire adult life. Nothing ever changed inside this house unless my mother approved it personally. My father sat in the living room recliner reading the newspaper while a golf tournament played quietly on television. He looked up over his glasses when I entered. "Margaret." No warmth. No smile. Just acknowledgement. "Dad." My mother disappeared toward the kitchen immediately. I was just making coffee. Of course she was. Conversations in this house always happened around carefully. Arranged hospitality. I removed my coat slowly and sat on the edge of the couch across from my father. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. He folded his newspaper deliberately before finally studying me with the same expression he used my entire childhood whenever he thought I looked disappointing. "Daniel says you seem upset lately." There it was already. Information traveling through family channels before I even arrived. "I have had a difficult few weeks," I replied evenly. My father nodded once like a doctor confirming symptoms. "Your mother and I worry about you." I looked directly at him. "Do you?" Something flickered across his face briefly. Annoyance, maybe. My mother returned carrying a silver tray with coffee cups arranged neatly beside sugar cookies she probably baked yesterday afternoon. She sat gracefully in the armchair beside the fireplace and smiled gently at me. "You look tired, sweetheart." Sweetheart. Another word she weaponized beautifully. I wrapped my hands around the warm coffee mug, but did not drink from it. "I went to the bookstore yesterday," I said quietly. The room changed instantly. Not dramatically. That was not how my parents operated. But I saw it anyway. My father's jaw tightened slightly. My mother's fingers paused against her coffee cup for half a second before resuming movement. Tiny reactions most people would miss entirely. "What bookstore?" she asked lightly. "The one downtown where I interviewed in March." Silence settled briefly between us. My heartbeat felt loud suddenly. "The manager remembered your phone call." My mother blinked once. Then she smiled softly with visible confusion. "Phone call." I held her gaze steadily. "The one where you warned them not to hire me." For the first time in years, I watched my mother carefully instead of emotionally. And what I saw chilled me. Not guilt. Calculation. She tilted her head slightly, the same gesture she used whenever she wanted others to question my perspective instead of hers. "Margaret, I think you may have misunderstood something." There it was. Immediate redirection. Reality bending. My father set down his coffee cup harder than necessary. "We were trying to help." "You. Help again. Always help. By telling employers I am unstable?" I asked quietly. My mother's expression softened with almost theatrical sadness. "Honey, after your divorce and all the financial struggles." "What financial struggles?" I interrupted calmly. Both of them looked startled. I almost never interrupted them growing up. "I lost my job during the pandemic like millions of Americans. I downsized. I survived. That does not make me unstable." My father's face darkened immediately. "Watch your tone." The old reflex to apologize rose automatically in my throat. But this time, I swallowed it down. "No," I said quietly. The room went still. Even the television noise suddenly seemed distant. My mother stared at me carefully now, like she no longer recognized the version sitting in front of her. "Excuse me," she asked softly. "No, I am not doing this anymore." My own voice surprised me with how calm it sounded. "You called employers behind my back for years and convinced people I could not function independently." My father leaned forward sharply. "Because every time you try to manage life on your own, everything falls apart." I looked at him steadily. Or maybe you just made sure it did. The silence afterward felt enormous. My mother's eyes widened slightly. My father stared at me like I had spoken another language entirely. And suddenly I realized something strange. They genuinely did not expect resistance. Not from me. Not ever. My mother recovered first. She sighed softly and folded her hands together. Margaret, we sacrificed our entire lives trying to protect you from bad decisions. Protect. Such a gentle word for imprisonment. You mean control me. That is unfair. Is it? My voice remained quiet, but firm now. You told strangers I was emotionally unstable. You interfered with jobs. You convinced Daniel something was wrong with me too. At the mention of Daniel, my mother's eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. Another tiny reaction. Another confirmation. My father stood up slowly from his recliner, towering over the living room with cold authority that used to terrify me as a child. You are being dramatic. I almost smiled hearing that word. Dramatic. Emotional. Sensitive. Their favorite vocabulary whenever I questioned them. Suddenly, I understood something deeply unsettling. They had repeated those labels so often throughout my life that eventually I carried them for them willingly. Like invisible luggage. My mother spoke again before I could respond. Margaret, sweetheart, maybe you should sit down with someone professionally if these thoughts are upsetting you this much. There it was. The final strategy. If denial failed, question my sanity directly. Years ago, that sentence would have shattered me. I would have cried, defended myself desperately, apologized for overreacting. But sitting there in their spotless living room surrounded by expensive furniture and carefully staged family photos, I felt something entirely different. Clarity. Quiet, devastating clarity. I stood up slowly and picked up my coat from the couch. My parents watched me carefully now with expressions somewhere between confusion and irritation. I used to think there was something wrong with me, I said softly. But normal parents do not spend years trying to destroy their daughter's independence. My mother opened her mouth immediately. That is not what we. I am not finished. The words came out calm enough to silence the entire room. Even my father stopped moving. I looked at both of them one last time. The people who raised me, controlled me, rewrote me piece by piece until I no longer trusted my own mind. You taught me to doubt myself so completely that I never noticed you were the reason I kept failing. Neither of them spoke now. And for the first time in my entire life, I think they finally realized I could see them clearly. I drove home from my parents' house with the radio turned off and both hands locked tightly around the steering wheel. The late afternoon sun reflected sharply off wet pavement, while rows of bare trees blurred past outside the windows. Usually after visiting my parents, I felt drained and guilty at the same time. Guilty for upsetting them. Guilty for failing to keep peace. Guilty for somehow always becoming the difficult daughter before the conversation even ended. But today felt different. For the first time in my life, I was not replaying the visit wondering whether I had overreacted. I was replaying it realizing how carefully every word had been designed to make me question myself. Even now, after being confronted directly, neither of them apologized. They simply changed tactics. Confusion, concern, subtle accusations about my emotional state. The realization settled into me slowly as traffic crawled through downtown Columbus. My parents did not accidentally control people. They studied them, especially me. By the time I reached my apartment building, the sky had already begun fading into soft shades of gray and gold. I carried my purse upstairs feeling strangely exhausted, like my entire nervous system had finally stopped bracing itself after decades. Inside the apartment, silence greeted me immediately. Normally the quiet felt lonely. Tonight it felt necessary. I kicked off my shoes near the door and stood in the middle of the living room staring at nothing for several long seconds. Then my phone rang. Daniel again. I almost ignored it after our conversation the night before, but something told me not to. Hi, Mom, he said carefully the moment I answered. Not casual this time. Careful. I just got off the phone with Grandma. I walked slowly toward the kitchen and leaned against the counter. I assumed you would. He sighed quietly. She is very upset. Of course she was. My mother always became wounded the moment someone stopped cooperating with her version of reality. Did she tell you she called my employers? Silence. Then finally, she said she was trying to protect you from stress. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was again. Protection. Always wrapped in kindness. Always justified as love. Daniel, she told strangers I was mentally unstable. She did not use those exact words. I laughed softly under my breath. Even now, he was defending technicalities instead of truth. Did she deny making the calls? Another pause. No. I pulled out a chair and sat slowly at the kitchen table. The overhead light cast soft yellow shadows across unpaid bills, and old paperwork still spread everywhere from the night before. Then why are we still debating this? I asked quietly. Daniel sounded frustrated now. Because they are old, Mom. Maybe they handled things badly, but I do not think they were trying to hurt you. Hurt me. Such a small phrase for something that lasted decades. I looked toward the dark apartment window where my reflection stared back faintly. Do you know how many jobs I lost because of them? He said nothing. Do you know I skipped medication last winter because I could not afford refills? More silence. Do you know I sat in parking lots crying after interviews because I thought something was wrong with me? His voice softened slightly then. Mom. No, Daniel. Listen to me for once. My own voice remained calm, but underneath it something stronger had started forming. Your grandparents spent years convincing me I could not survive without them, and somehow everyone around me accepted it. I heard him exhale heavily through the phone. I just do not know what you want me to say. The answer came to me immediately. I wanted him to believe me. Completely. Without hesitation. Without excuses attached. But I suddenly realized how impossible that might be. My parents had decades to shape his understanding of me. Tiny comments. Little stories. Concerned sighs over holidays. People rarely notice manipulation when it arrives disguised as family worry. I do not need you to fix it, I said finally. I just need you to stop pretending this is normal. Daniel fell quiet again. Then, unexpectedly, he asked something that made my stomach tighten. Did Grandma ever do this before? I stared at the refrigerator humming softly beside me. I think she has been doing versions of this my entire life. He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded distant. Thoughtful. Heather mentioned something strange after I told her everything. I sat upright slightly. What? Apparently Grandma called her a few months ago after you applied at the retirement community. My heartbeat slowed strangely. What did she say? She warned Heather that you might start making reckless financial decisions if you became too independent again. The room went still around me. Too independent. Again. Not independent. Again. Like autonomy itself was dangerous for me specifically. Daniel continued slowly, sounding more uncertain now. At the time, Heather thought she was just worried about you getting overwhelmed. But after our conversation, he stopped speaking. I finished the sentence silently myself. After our conversation, the pattern finally looked different. Did Heather tell you anything else? I asked quietly. Just that Grandma kept saying family needed to stay united because you were vulnerable after the divorce. Vulnerable. Another carefully chosen word. My mother loved words that sounded compassionate while quietly removing my credibility at the same time. Emotional. Sensitive. Vulnerable. Overwhelmed. Every label softened me into someone easier to dismiss. Daniel spoke again more quietly now. Mom, why would they do this? The question lingered between us. And suddenly I realized something important. For the first time, he was not defending them immediately. He was asking. Really asking. I leaned back slowly in the chair. Outside, darkness had settled fully over the parking lot, while headlights moved silently below my apartment window. Because if I believed I could survive on my own, I said softly, then they could not control me anymore. The line stayed quiet after that. Then finally Daniel said something I never expected to hear from him. I think maybe I owe you an apology. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Not because the words fixed anything. They did not. But because someone in the family had finally stopped protecting the illusion long enough to see me clearly for a moment. You were raised by them too, I replied quietly. So were you. Another long silence followed. Then Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. Heather wants us to come by this weekend with the kids if that is okay. Normally I would have said yes immediately out of relief. Any invitation from family always felt precious after years of subtle exclusion. But tonight I paused. I thought about my mother speaking privately to Heather behind my back. I thought about all the times invitations disappeared mysteriously or plans changed suddenly. The birthdays where I arrived late because someone gave me the wrong time. The holidays where I was told things would stay small only to later discover large gatherings happened without me. For years, I blamed misunderstandings. Now I wondered how many were orchestrated quietly behind the scenes. Maybe another time, I said gently. Daniel sounded surprised. Are you sure? Yes. And for the first time in my life, I realized I actually meant it. After we hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen for a very long time listening to the soft ticking of the wall clock above the stove. Then slowly, I reached for the old spiral notebook again. One page after another, I started reading carefully through years of notes, reminders, appointments, and forgotten memories. Around midnight, I found another sentence that made my chest tighten instantly. Elaine requested contact information for my office manager. Said she wanted to surprise me for Employee Appreciation Week. I stared at the line until my vision blurred slightly. I never received any surprise at work that year. But 2 weeks later, my supervisor suddenly started treating me differently. More cautious, less trusting. At the time, I assumed I had done something wrong professionally. Now I wondered what exactly my mother told her instead. I closed the notebook slowly and rested both hands against the cover. Piece by piece, my entire past was rearranging itself into something darker than I ever imagined. But underneath the grief and anger, another feeling had quietly begun growing stronger every day. Freedom. Terrifying freedom. Because once you finally see the truth clearly, pretending not to see it anymore becomes impossible. 3 days later, I received a letter from my landlord taped neatly to my apartment door. The paper fluttered slightly in the cold hallway draft while I stood there holding grocery bags against my hip. Final notice. Rent past due. My stomach tightened immediately even before I finished reading the rest. I already knew what it would say. I had been juggling payments for months, shifting money between utilities, groceries, and prescriptions while hoping another interview would finally turn into a paycheck. But now the words looked different somehow. Before, overdue rent felt like proof of personal failure. Another example of why my parents believed I could not manage life alone. Now I saw something else entirely. Consequences. Manufactured consequences. I unlocked the apartment door slowly and carried the groceries inside. A gallon of milk, soup cans, bread, store-brand coffee. I had become skilled at calculating exactly how long $20 could stretch through a week. The apartment felt colder than usual that morning despite the heater humming loudly near the windows. I placed the groceries on the kitchen counter and sat down at the table with the notice in front of me. 5 days. That was all the time I had before late fees increased again. I rubbed my forehead slowly while staring at the paper. Then my phone buzzed. My mother's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I considered ignoring it completely. But something told me to answer. Hello. My mother's voice flowed warmly through the phone immediately, smooth as silk. Margaret, sweetheart, I was thinking about you this morning. Of course she was. I leaned back quietly in the chair. Really? I know things have been tense lately, and I hate that. Her tone carried practiced sadness now. No matter what disagreements happen, you are still our daughter. I stared at the overdue notice without speaking. Your father and I were discussing your situation last night. She continued gently. We are worried about you staying alone in that apartment. There it was already. Not asking how I felt. Not apologizing. Straight to positioning herself as rescuer again. I am fine, I replied evenly. My mother sighed softly. Margaret, please be realistic. Daniel says you are behind on rent now. My chest tightened immediately. Daniel told them. Or maybe Heather did. Information moved through the family constantly, while I remained the last person to know anything. I can handle it. Sweetheart. Her voice lowered into that familiar pitying tone I had heard my entire life. There is no shame in admitting you need help. I looked around the apartment slowly. The faded curtains, the thrift store furniture, the stack of library, books beside the recliner. Small, humble pieces of a life I built myself despite everything. Suddenly, the thought of returning to my parents' house made my skin crawl. What exactly are you offering? I asked carefully. My mother brightened immediately, relief entering her voice too quickly. Your father, and I think it would be best if you moved back home for a while. There it was. The destination hidden underneath years of sabotage. Dependence. Full dependence. I stayed silent long enough that she continued speaking quickly to fill the space. Just until you get back on your feet. We could convert the guest room into something comfortable. You would not need to worry about bills or groceries anymore. And honestly, at your age, having family nearby would be safer. Safer. Another harmless-sounding word wrapped around control. I suddenly pictured myself trapped again inside that immaculate colonial house, where every movement required approval. My mother monitoring my schedule. My father questioning every decision. Family dinners where they spoke about me instead of to me. No paycheck. No independence. No ability to leave. My throat felt tight suddenly. Not from fear anymore. Recognition. You planned this, I said quietly. Silence. Tiny. Barely noticeable. But there. What do you mean? She asked softly. The job calls. The stories about me. Convincing people I could not function alone. My voice remained calm now. You wanted me desperate enough to come back. Margaret, that is ridiculous. But she sounded sharper now. Less polished. I leaned forward slightly over the kitchen table. Then why are you offering me a room instead of helping me repair the damage you caused? Another silence followed. Longer this time. Then my mother's voice returned colder underneath the sweetness. Because employers do not forget instability once concerns are raised. I froze completely. She said it so casually. So matter of fact. Like she knew exactly how permanent the damage was because she created it intentionally. You really did this, I whispered. My mother exhaled softly into the phone. We did what parents are supposed to do. We protected you from making choices you could not handle. Something inside me settled permanently in that moment. Not shattered. Settled. Like dust finally reaching the floor after years floating in confusion. No, I said quietly. You protected yourselves from losing control over me. My mother's tone sharpened further now that the performance no longer worked. At 67 years old, Margaret, you cannot honestly believe you are going to start over successfully by yourself. There it was. The real belief underneath everything. Not concern. Contempt. My entire life, my parents never saw me as capable. Only manageable. My hand tightened slowly around the phone. I would have had a chance if you had not spent years sabotaging me. You always blame other people when life becomes difficult. I almost laughed hearing that. My mother accusing someone else of avoiding responsibility felt almost impressive in its hypocrisy. I have proof now. The line went quiet immediately. Excuse me, she asked carefully. Employers documented your calls. Silence again. Heavier this time. I could practically hear her recalculating strategy through the phone. Then finally she spoke very softly. Be careful what stories you tell people, Margaret. You already know how emotional stress affects your judgment. The threat beneath the sentence chilled me completely. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a quiet reminder that she still intended to attack my credibility if necessary. Suddenly, another memory surfaced from years earlier. I was 34 years old, sitting in a therapist's office after my second miscarriage while crying from exhaustion and grief. My mother insisted on attending one session for support. Halfway through the appointment, she smiled sadly at the therapist and said, Margaret tends to become overwhelmed and distort situations emotionally. At the time, I felt embarrassed, ashamed. Now I realized she was establishing authority over my reality even there. Everywhere. Always. I stood slowly from the kitchen table and walked toward the apartment window while holding the phone tightly against my ear. Outside, an elderly man shuffled carefully across the icy parking lot carrying groceries alone. No one hovered over him, insisting he was incapable simply because he was aging. No one treated him like a child trapped inside an older body. I am not moving back into your house, I said calmly. My mother's voice turned icy for the first time all conversation. Then do not expect us to rescue you when things fall apart. Rescue. Such an interesting word for people who pushed someone underwater first. Goodbye, Mom. Margaret. I ended the call before she could continue. Then I stood motionless by the window while my heart pounded heavily against my ribs. The apartment felt unbearably quiet afterward. But underneath the fear and anger, another realization had started growing stronger. My mother slipped during that conversation. Just enough. She admitted employers would not forget the concerns once raised. Not if random misunderstandings happened accidentally. Only if someone intentionally poisoned my reputation thoroughly enough to leave permanent damage behind. I walked slowly back toward the kitchen table and looked again at the overdue rent notice. 5 days. The fear should have consumed me. But strangely, it did not. Because for the first time, I understood something clearly. My parents believed desperation would force me back under their control, which meant surviving independently now mattered about far more than money. It was the first real act of freedom I had ever attempted in my entire life. The next morning, I woke before sunrise without needing an alarm. Pale blue light seeped through the apartment blinds while the heater clicked softly somewhere behind the bedroom wall. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Then reality settled over me all at once. The overdue rent notice. My mother's phone call. The realization that my entire adult life had been shaped quietly by people who claimed to love me most. I lay there staring at the ceiling for several long moments while the old apartment creaked gently around me. Usually mornings were the hardest part of my day. That heavy, helpless feeling always arrived before my feet even touched the floor. But today something felt different. Not hopeful exactly. Clearer, like fog slowly lifting from a road I had been driving. Blind for years. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table wrapped in my gray cardigan while darkness still lingered outside the windows. Then I opened my laptop and searched for every employer I could remember interviewing with over the past 10 years. The list became longer than I expected. Medical offices, schools, retail management positions, churches, libraries, administrative work, places where interviews went beautifully until suddenly they did not. I started writing down names beside dates, building a timeline carefully across yellow legal paper. By 8:30, my kitchen table looked like a detective board from an old crime movie. Notes, phone numbers, dates circled in red ink, patterns becoming impossible to ignore. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Nearly every rejected opportunity happened shortly after moments when I started gaining confidence again. After my divorce when I planned to move. After paying off credit card debt independently. After making new friends through church groups or volunteer work. Every single time life began opening slightly for me, something quietly collapsed behind the scenes. My mother did not just want me dependent financially. She wanted me uncertain emotionally. Because uncertain people stay easier to control. My phone buzzed suddenly beside the coffee cup. Heather this time. I stared at her name before answering cautiously. "Good morning," she said softly. Her voice sounded unusually nervous. "I hope I am not bothering you." "No." A brief silence followed. Then she exhaled quietly. "Daniel told me about your conversation with Grandma yesterday." I waited. Heather cleared her throat awkwardly. "Margaret, there is something I think you should know." My chest tightened immediately. I stood and walked slowly toward the living room window while holding the phone carefully against my ear. Outside, a maintenance worker scattered salt across the icy parking lot below. "What is it?" I asked quietly. "About 6 months ago, your mother called me after your interview at the retirement community." Heather sounded uncomfortable now. "At the time, I honestly thought she was just worried about you. But now," she trailed off. "What did she say exactly?" Another pause. "She asked me to convince Daniel not to let you handle your own finances anymore." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "What?" Heather rushed forward quickly. "She said you were becoming confused and impulsive. She was worried you might embarrass yourself professionally or get manipulated by strangers." My grip tightened around the phone. Embarrass yourself professionally. Another familiar phrase. My mother recycled the same language constantly until everyone around me absorbed it without noticing. Did Daniel believe her? I asked carefully. Heather hesitated too long. At first, a little. Pain moved through my chest quietly. Not sharp anymore. Heavy. Like grief finally settling into permanent shape. Heather continued softly. "Margaret, I need you to understand something. I think your parents genuinely convinced themselves they were helping you." I closed my eyes briefly. That was the terrifying part. Control wrapped in righteousness becomes almost impossible to challenge because the people doing it feel morally justified. "Did she ask you to tell me any of this?" I asked. "No. Actually, she told me not to because she thought it would upset you unnecessarily." Of course she did. Protecting me from the truth while poisoning my life behind my back. The manipulation felt endless now that I could finally see it clearly. Heather lowered her voice slightly. "There is something else." My heartbeat slowed. "What?" "About 3 years ago, after your divorce, your father asked Daniel whether he would consider legal guardianship eventually if your mental state declined." I stopped breathing for a second. Guardianship. The word echoed through my mind like cold metal dropping onto concrete. Legal control. Financial control. Full dependency authorized officially. "What did Daniel say?" I whispered. "He thought Grandpa was overreacting. But your father kept insisting the family needed to prepare before things became worse." Worse. They built an entire future around my supposed instability long before I even realized it existed. Suddenly, dozens of strange moments over the years rearranged themselves inside my mind. Family conversations stopping when I entered rooms. Heather occasionally asking overly careful questions about my bills. Daniel offering to help organize my finances despite barely understanding his own taxes half the time. They had all been slowly trained to see me as fragile, incompetent, one step away from collapse. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes, but I blinked them back quickly. Not sadness. Mourning. Mourning the version of myself my family never allowed to exist freely. Heather spoke again, more gently now. I do not think Daniel understood how serious any of this was until now. I leaned my forehead lightly against the cold apartment window. Neither did I. Outside, sunlight finally broke through the gray clouds for the first time in days, reflecting sharply across wet pavement below. Everything suddenly looked too bright, too exposed. Margaret. Heather hesitated carefully. What are you going to do? The question lingered between us while I stared out at the parking lot. 6 months ago, I would have answered differently. I would have said I just wanted peace. I would have minimized everything to avoid conflict. But something fundamental had changed inside me now. I am going to stop letting them define me, I said quietly. After the call ended, I stood motionless by the window for a very long time. Then slowly, I walked back to the kitchen table and looked again at the scattered papers covering the surface. For the first time, I no longer saw random disappointments or personal failures. I saw evidence, a pattern stretching across decades. A campaign built carefully enough that even I believed it for years. My eyes drifted toward the overdue rent notice sitting near the edge of the table. 5 days left. Fear flickered briefly through me again. Then another thought arrived immediately afterward. If my parents truly believed I could not survive independently, then surviving became the most important thing I had ever done. Not perfectly, not impressively, just honestly, on my own terms. I sat down slowly and opened my laptop again. This time, instead of searching for jobs, I searched for something else entirely. Legal consultation for family interference and defamation in Ohio. Several websites appeared instantly across the screen. Most discussed workplace sabotage between former spouses or business rivals. But one phrase near the top caught my attention immediately. Intentional interference with employment opportunities. My heartbeat quickened slightly as I read further. Individuals who knowingly provide false, damaging information to employers may be held legally responsible under certain circumstances. I stared at the sentence while silence filled the apartment around me. My parents spent years convincing me I had no power, that I was helpless without them, weak, confused, incapable of functioning independently. But suddenly, for the first time in my life, I realized something astonishing. What they did was not just cruel. It might actually have consequences. 2 days later, I sat in the waiting room of a small law office downtown, holding a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold in my hands. Outside the large windows, traffic moved slowly through slushy March streets, while people hurried past wearing heavy coats and scarves against the wind. The office itself smelled faintly like old books and printer toner. Quiet instrumental music drifted softly through hidden speakers overhead, while a receptionist typed steadily behind the front desk. I kept smoothing invisible wrinkles from my navy blue skirt with nervous fingers. Part of me still felt ridiculous being there at all. Lawsuits belonged to angry people, confident people, people who believed their pain mattered enough to defend publicly. My parents spent my entire life teaching me the opposite. The receptionist smiled gently toward me. Ms. Whitaker? Ms. Monroe will see you now. I stood slowly and followed her down a narrow hallway lined with framed legal certificates and family photographs. Patricia Monroe's office sat at the very end beside a window overlooking downtown Columbus. She looked to be in her early 60s with silver streaks through dark brown hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind thin glasses. The moment I entered, she stood to shake my hand warmly. Margaret, please sit down. Her office felt comfortable rather than intimidating. Shelves filled with law books lined one wall, while a small lamp cast soft golden light across the desk instead of harsh fluorescent brightness. For some reason, that tiny detail calmed me slightly. Patricia sat across from me holding a legal pad and pen. You mentioned on the phone this involves family interference with employment opportunities? I nodded slowly. Then, for nearly 40 minutes, I told her everything. The phone calls, the rejected jobs, the bookstore manager, the conversations with Heather and Daniel, my mother's attempt to move me back home after my rent problems. At first, my voice trembled occasionally from embarrassment. Saying the story out loud still felt surreal. But Patricia listened without interruption or visible skepticism. That alone nearly made me emotional. When I finally finished speaking, silence settled briefly across the office. Patricia folded her hands together thoughtfully. "Margaret," she said carefully, "how long have your parents been portraying you as unstable to other people?" The question caught me off guard because it assumed the behavior existed instead of questioning whether I imagined it. I stared down at my hands quietly. "I think my entire life." Patricia nodded slowly like she had heard similar stories before. Family control often becomes normalized when it develops gradually over decades. The sentence hit me harder than I expected. Normalized. Exactly. If someone locked you in a room suddenly, you would recognize imprisonment immediately. But if they slowly convinced you the outside world was too dangerous to survive without them, eventually you stopped trying to leave voluntarily. Patricia reached for her legal pad again. "Do you currently have direct evidence of false statements made to employers?" I handed her copies of notes and timelines I spent days organizing carefully. Susan's written documentation, dates of interviews, names, phone records from my mother's calls. Patricia studied everything quietly while I watched sunlight reflect across passing cars outside her office window. Finally, she looked back up at me. "This is significant." My heartbeat quickened slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means your parents may have crossed legal lines repeatedly." Hearing the words spoken aloud felt strangely unreal. For years, my parents positioned themselves as respectable pillars of the community. Church volunteers, charity donors, reliable neighbors. My father served on local committees. My mother organized holiday drives every winter. People trusted them automatically because people trust older polite couples automatically. Patricia continued carefully. Intentionally damaging someone's employment opportunities using false information can potentially qualify as tortious interference and defamation, depending on circumstances and proof. I blinked slowly, trying to process the terminology. "So they could actually face consequences?" Patricia gave a small, measured nod. "Possibly, especially if this behavior caused measurable financial harm over time." Financial harm. Lost wages. Overdue rent. Medication skipped because I could not afford refills. Years shrinking my life smaller and smaller while believing failure belonged entirely to me. Suddenly, tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. Embarrassed, I looked down immediately. "I am sorry," I whispered. Patricia's expression softened slightly. "Do not apologize for finally being heard." The kindness in her voice nearly undid me completely, because that was the cruelest part of long-term manipulation. Eventually, you stop expecting anyone to believe you fully. Patricia leaned back thoughtfully in her chair. "May I ask something personal?" I nodded carefully. "Why did your parents want you dependent on them?" The question lingered heavily between us. I thought about my mother's immaculate house, my father's constant authority, their obsession with appearing necessary and respected. "Control," I said quietly. "I think they needed me weaker than them to feel secure." Patricia nodded slowly again. "That is unfortunately more common than people realize." She reached for a business card beside her desk and slid it toward me. "Before making any decisions legally, I would strongly recommend documenting every interaction moving forward, especially anything involving finances, housing, or attempts to undermine your credibility further." I looked at the card resting on the polished wood surface. Patricia Monroe, family and civil litigation. My whole life, I associated lawyers with divorce, debt, and scandal. Sitting there now, the card felt strangely different. Not conflict, protection. As the meeting ended, Patricia stood and walked me toward the office door personally. Before I left, she paused carefully beside the hallway window. "Margaret." "Yes." People who manipulate others for decades rely heavily on silence and self-doubt. The moment you stop participating in either one, their control weakens significantly. I carried those words with me the entire drive home. Outside, late afternoon sunlight shimmered across melting snowbanks while church bells rang faintly somewhere downtown. Everything looked painfully ordinary compared to the storm unfolding quietly inside my life. Back at the apartment building, I climbed the stairs slowly with Patricia's card tucked safely inside my purse. For the first time in months, the overdue rent notice waiting inside no longer felt like proof I was failing. It felt temporary, circumstantial, solvable. As I unlocked my apartment door, laughter echoed faintly from another unit down the hallway. A television played somewhere nearby. Ordinary people living ordinary lives while mine finally began unraveling into truth. Inside the apartment, my answering machine blinked with one new message. I pressed play absent-mindedly while setting down my purse. My mother's voice filled the kitchen immediately. "Margaret, your father and I are becoming extremely concerned about your recent behavior. Daniel mentioned you have been asking inappropriate questions and contacting old employers. We think it would be best if you stopped escalating things before you embarrass yourself publicly." I stood completely still listening to the message. Her tone sounded calm, controlled, but underneath it now, I heard something else clearly for the first time. Fear. Tiny, barely there, but real. Because somehow, despite everything they spent decades teaching me, I had finally done the one thing they never expected. I stopped believing them.